Title: The Cost of Revenge. Jason Morgan had spent his life walking a fine line between loyalty and violence. He had taken lives, protected his own, and ensured that those who crossed the people he loved paid the price. But nothing had ever shaken him quite like this. Standing inside Sonny's penthouse, Carly's voice broke through his thoughts. "You have to do this, Jason. He killed Danny. Cyrus deserves to die for what he did." Jason's jaw clenched as he looked at Carly. Her green eyes burned with grief and fury. He knew she needed revenge to feel like she was doing something, but he wasn't sure he could give her that. Not this time. Danny had been just a boy, his son. The son Jason had tried to protect by keeping his distance, by making choices that would ensure he wouldn't grow up in the shadow of violence. And yet somehow he had ended up in the middle of the war anyway. Jason turned away from Carly and looked out the window. The city's skyline glittered, indifferent to the loss that was tearing his soul apart. "Jason," Carly's voice softened. "He was your son. How can you just stand there?" Jason swallowed hard. He had felt this before, the kind of loss that made it hard to breathe. He had buried people he loved. But this? This was different. This wasn't a fellow soldier in the mob, a casualty of their way of life. This was Danny, his son. And yet, the thought of revenge didn't settle in his chest the way it once had. "Carly," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion, "what does killing Cyrus fix?" Carly blinked at him, as though she hadn't heard right. "It makes sure he can never hurt anyone again. It makes sure he pays, Jason. He took Danny from us." Jason closed his eyes. He wanted to believe it would bring peace, but he knew better. He had killed before. He had taken vengeance before. And none of it had ever brought back the people he lost. "Danny went after him," Jason said, his voice breaking for the first time. "I tried to keep him out of this life. He knew the risks." Carly shook her head violently. "No. That's not fair. He was just a kid. And you," she swallowed. "You're his father. You have to do something." Jason opened his eyes and met hers. "I can't bring him back." Carly stepped forward, her hands shaking as she grabbed his arm. "Jason, don't do this. Don't shut down. You always do this. You bury your grief, and you turn into a machine. But this isn't about business. This is personal. It's always personal," Jason murmured. He gently pried her fingers off his arm. "I can't do this anymore, Carly. Killing Cyrus won't fix anything." Carly stared at him as though he were a stranger. "So that's it? You're just gonna let him get away with it?" "No," Jason said, steel entering his voice. "But I won't be the one to pull the trigger." 2 weeks earlier, Danny Morgan had always been his father's son. Stubborn, determined, and above all, fiercely protective of his family. When Sam had told him to stay out of the business, to live a normal life, he had nodded and promised. But when he heard about Cyrus Renault making moves against Sonny's family again, something inside him had snapped. He had lost too many people already. His father had always been a shadow in his life, a presence that loomed large but felt just out of reach. He had tried to understand Jason's choices, to accept that his father loved him in the only way he knew how. But he couldn't sit by and do nothing. Not when Cyrus had already cost them so much. So, Danny did what no one expected. He went after Cyrus himself. The plan was reckless, but in his mind, it was perfect. He had watched his father for years, knew how to move unseen, how to track a target, how to wait for the right moment. But he wasn't Jason, and Cyrus was expecting him. The warehouse was dark when Danny slipped inside. He gripped the gun in his hand, his heart hammering. He had never taken a life before. He told himself it was justice, that it was right. Then, he felt the cold press of metal against his skull. "Brave," came the low, amused voice of Cyrus Renault. "But foolish." Danny sucked in a sharp breath. How had he gotten behind him so fast? Cyrus sighed, almost like he was disappointed. "You're just a boy playing at war. And now you die for it." Danny squeezed his eyes shut as the shot rang out. Present day. Jason stood over Danny's grave, his hands in the pockets of his leather jacket. The wind was cold, biting through his grief. A war was brewing. He could feel it. But for the first time in his life, Jason didn't know if he had the strength to fight it. Revenge had been his way of life for years, but it had never once brought him peace. And now, as he stood there, the weight of his choices pressing down on him, he realized something terrifying. He was tired, and he wasn't sure he could do this anymore. From a distance, Carly watched him, tears streaming down her face. The war wasn't over, but Jason Morgan was changing, and she didn't know if that was a good thing or the beginning of the end.